everyone. This is Samira Daswani here, the host of the podcast, The Patient from Hell. So you guys have actually met this guest before. You've heard Katie Coleman come on our podcast earlier this year and share a number of insights about her cancer experience. So we have her back today, as we promised in the last episode, to talk about a part of the cancer experience that a lot of people don't talk about. And they don't talk about it for a variety of reasons that we're going to get into. So Katie, welcome back.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me, and I'm excited to jump into this podcast, which feels like a weird topic to be excited about, but I think it's an area that like I was looking for somebody to talk about when I was diagnosed. So I think it's good that we're approaching the topic.
Okay. All right. So should we tell everyone what our topic is?
Yes.
All right. Do you want to do the honor? Do you want me to do the honor?
How about you do it?
Okay. All right. So we're going to go into the topic of mortality, end of life, and how to grapple with the uncertainty of effectively living. So maybe we start there, Katie. What does it mean to you?
Yeah. Which portion of that? Like mortality? All of it?
All of it. Maybe we want to tell, maybe actually we should do a quick recap of kind of where you are with the cancer diagnosis, if that's okay. And then maybe talk about the definition or how you feel about mortality.
Yeah. So I think that's actually probably a good place to start because it kind of frames how my thoughts around mortality have shifted. So I was first diagnosed with a rare stage 4 kidney cancer, coming up on, actually it was about 2.5 years ago now. And when I was first diagnosed, my relationship with mortality was 100% fear-based. I was petrified. And a lot of those fears came around looking up survival stats and seeing things like the really low rates of survival for like 5 years, for example. Yeah. And I was a newlywed at the time. I was 29 years old. And so in my mind, as I was reading through those stats, my relationship with mortality and the fact of even imagining like, if I only have 5 years, that felt devastating. Like only 5 years, that felt like one of the worst things that could ever happen. And through my diagnosis, I've had different prognoses at different points of time. I'm very thankful for where I'm at currently, and I'm doing really well. But through that process and having to accept and kind of think about my own mortality, some of my mindset around that shifted, which I'm sure we'll get into. But my relationship with the thought of being given 5 years now is very different than it was when I was first diagnosed. But I had to do a lot of that learning on my own. And it's something that I wish more people talked about because it's a very, very hard topic to try to go through on your own. And you can get very lost in despair and get yourself stuck in the process, I feel like.
Katie, can you actually go back to pre-diagnosis for a second? Because I don't know if you went through this, but I had not spent a lot of my time thinking, like actively thinking and feeling about mortality. Because like you, I was diagnosed just after I turned 30. And I don't think it's a lot. I don't think a lot of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds think about death. Like, I just don't think we do that. So I don't know if you had any pre-cancer mortality related like thoughts, feelings, understandings.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I actually had a lot of it because I suffered from anxiety, like especially as I was going through the diagnostic process. It took me about 1.5 years to get diagnosed and nobody could tell me what was wrong. And so in my head, I just kept thinking like, I'm dying, I'm dying. And I like, my mind kept going to if I had cancer. I think we talked about this on the other podcast. Like I had even asked doctors if it could possibly be cancer. And the answer was like, no, you're too young. And so in my mind, like I had already had some of those fears of what that could be like. But at the same time, I was also going on with life and planning, right? So like I was a newlywed. We were planning out what our future was like. I spent my entire life planning what like 30 years from now looked like because I was trying to put in all of the extra work, really progress my career and make sacrifices in my 20s so that I could enjoy my like 30s, 40s, 50s. And so I kind of had a little bit of both. I did think about it beforehand. But it was more of a like fear of it without actually ever addressing that it could be a reality than it was once that actually came into the scope of what I was actually having to deal with once I did get diagnosed.
And how do I ask this question? So diagnosis happens. How soon after the sort of like confirmed diagnosis does like the fear of death creep in for you?
It's a great question too, because for me it was instantly in the ER. I didn't have like 100% confirmed diagnosis when I was in the ER.
Yeah.
I knew I had a very gigantic tumor. If we're on video here, anybody that's on video can see the tumor. This is a 3D replica of it. It's larger than a softball. And that was on my right kidney. And so we had a pretty good idea that it was likely cancer, because I also had a bunch of tumors in my liver, but we hadn't done a biopsy or anything of it. And there is a type of tumor called a oncocytoma that can be benign, which is what mine was supposed to be once we actually did biopsy it. But the lesions in my liver actually ended up being tumors as well too, which is what put me in that super rare category. But while I was in the ER, like those thoughts instantly hit me when I got home, because I had gone literally from like picking out rooms for our future children to starting to pick out like cancer centers and hospitals and trying to figure out what life was going to be like, as I tried to fight this thing. Yeah. And so I was looking up survival stats while I was in the ER waiting for results. And so we had a pretty good idea it was kidney cancer, even though it wasn't confirmed yet. And so once I officially got my diagnosis, that didn't really shift my mindset too much in that, because I had already kind of assumed that it was cancer.
If you're okay with that, I'd love to share kind of my sort of journey through it.
Yeah, I would love to hear that side.
It was actually kind of different than yours. I found the tumor myself. It was my armpit. So it wasn't actually my breast. I didn't know it was going to be breast cancer for a while. And I had just taken a new job, and someone senior in that organization was the first person to tell me I had cancer. Clinician by background, not oncologist. He was like, you know what, this is most likely cancer. If you need an oncologist, call me. And I just remember being like, okay. Didn't expect that. You know, first week on the job. Not really, don't know you. But
no.
Okay. And then ended up going through the kind of like imaging process, kind of similar to you. Got imaging done, and it was like, at that point, I was like, I was almost certain it was going to come out as cancer, but hadn't gotten the biopsy results yet. But the funny thing is, I don't think the notion of death came up for me until maybe a year into treatment.
I was going to ask you that because I think we'd have a conversation before where I knew nothing about cancer before I was diagnosed. I was like not in the medical field. I just knew absolutely nothing. And so when I got diagnosed, I didn't even have the context of like, I thought I was going to die next week. Like I thought that's how quickly cancer progressed. Yeah. Whereas I think you had a little bit more background and understanding. And so do you feel like that shaped kind of why it was a delayed process for you?
I think it did. I do think it shaped the delayed process, but I also think I don't know about you, but I've learned something about myself through this whole thing. And part of what I've learned is my emotional reaction to life not going in the way I had planned it, which cancer is definitely
not how you plan.
of what you do not plan for.
Yes.
Is I think anger. And I think for me, it required a lot of dissipation of anger for the fear to actually creep in, or at least for me to realize that I was feeling fear. And I think it wasn't anger that like I got cancer. I wasn't mad about that. I was mostly mad about how crappy the healthcare system is, on how it doesn't really set up patients for navigating just about anything, let alone a horrible diagnosis. And so I think for me, I just remember this. I just remember being angry a lot. And a lot of people were like, hey, are you mad? Like, are you questioning why you? And I was like, yeah, I never questioned why me. For me, it was that part was like, for me, relatively easy, which was statistics and probabilities. And I just, my body just had the mutation. I'm like, okay, like something happened. But I think for me, a lot of the anger was like, our oncologists don't have the time. They're not set up to have the time to spend with you. You're
Mm-hmm.
running around like a headless chicken. You're treated like, you're just dismissed, and you're treated like you don't know anything, which, okay, fair enough. Like, I don't know anything about oncology, fair enough. But
Yeah.
the lack of dignity and respect, and the lack of kind of just being treated like a consumer in a world where healthcare costs are skyrocketing and it is coming out of your pocket. Like,
Mm-hmm.
which other industry do you go into and you're treated like complete shit?
When
And
you're
yet
paying the
it's
amount of money that you're
$1
paying.
bill. Yeah, it's like, huh? I just remember being mad. So, like, for me, I like distinctly remember when mortality came up. I was on a walk with a mentor of mine. And this was just when the pandemic had like started to die down a little bit, and we'd gone on this like walk around campus, and we were talking about the planner I had built, and he goes, like, uh, it's super incredible that you like managed to take something like this, and you almost died. And I was like, I almost died. And it was that moment of like, wait a minute. It had never occurred to me that I almost died. It had never crossed my mind. And
Yeah.
it required someone else telling me that for me to like understand that, yeah, we grapple with mortality. That was very real. And after that moment, it took over my mind actually for a good year and a half. But it
Yeah.
required him to tell me. And I was like,
I feel like, so I actually had this conversation with another patient pretty recently because it's really weird for me when I hear other people tell my story, because I will hear other people tell my story of like, she was terminal, or like, and like, technically speaking, yes, like I still have a hard time even saying that, because like, who says I'm not terminal now? Knock on wood, hopefully I'm not. um, but I very much recognize what stage 4 cancer is in general. Um, and but like that terminology isn't something that I had ever really used before. And I think, I don't know if it was like this for you, but as I was going through the process, it was like one foot in front of the other. Like I had that fear and I did face those
yes.
fears very early on, but it was just one foot in front of the other. And I have, since getting through that, and especially since I kind of processed the whole idea around mortality, um, I minimize what so much of that is. That sometimes I forget until my story is repeated back to me. Even from like my own doctors, like that. I had something that came up the other day. I can't remember what it was, but I had sent a message to my doctor to like ask about if something was like, if everything was okay. And I remember like getting some type of response of like, well, your body's been through a lot. So like, I would expect that. And in my mind, I see so many other patients that have gone through so much more than I have that I constantly minimize it. And I'm like, oh, I've been through nothing. Like this is nothing to, and so I discount that and I don't think about that. So I could see how somebody else bringing it up to you triggers those thoughts, because I know it does that for me too. Like I can even recite my story knowing the things that I went through, and like know that that's like impactful for other people to hear and it feels like a lot, but to me it just like, since it's in the past almost, it, my body also, or like my mind doesn't fully process the gravity of it sometimes.
I fully relate to that. I relate to that so much. I was, I fully relate to that. And it's, I'm always surprised at how much I'm able to dismiss kind of both
Yeah.
emotionally and physically what our bodies have gone through. At least mine. I dismiss it all the time. And
Hmm. I
it
think especially if I don't know if it's like this for you, but the better I've felt, like once I got through, like it was an easier reminder, like when it still hurt to laugh, right? Like after surgery, or when I was still dealing with side effects and stuff like that. But the better I've felt sometimes, especially the further I've gotten out, I'm almost 2 years out from surgery now. And sometimes I'll catch myself like reminding myself like, oh yeah, like I went through that. Like I can't expect my body to do that. Or like as I'm drinking water to make sure I'm constantly hydrated and remembering like, oh yeah, I've got one kidney, because I feel better, honestly, than I did before I had surgery, and even before I had my diagnosis. And so mentally, that can be a really hard thing sometimes to grasp of like, I feel so well now, but my body really has been through a lot of trauma.
I would love for us to talk about what you just said, because I think that's another part of the cancer experience that I think is not spoken about, which is I, like you, feel a lot better now than I did pre-diagnosis.
Yeah.
Emotionally, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Physically, to a large extent, much better. And I mean, there are some days where I'm like, okay, maybe not. But for the
Yeah.
most part, actually, I do feel much, much better. And I think that's the other piece where I think there's this narrative out there, right? Which is this has to be the worst thing in the world. And it's almost like I sometimes feel as though people want to think of me as a victim.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, well, I don't feel like a victim. I don't feel like
Yeah.
a hero, but I don't feel like a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel, I just feel better than I used to be.
Yeah. I I mean, I think it's difficult, right? Because there are so many patients. Like, I recognize how fortunate I am to be in the position that I am,
Yes.
and that there's many patients that don't feel better as they go along through their diagnosis. But one thing that I found, even talking to many patients that like may physically feel unwell after their diagnosis, is that mental shift. And I don't know what it's like for other patients, and it'd be great to get your perspective on kind of what changed it for you. But for me, so much what changed that was actually grappling with my own mortality and kind of recognizing what life is about to me and what's important to me. And all of those things just completely shifted my perspective. I get the question all the time, like people asking me if cancer changed me or changed the way I think about things. And I've said on multiple occasions, like I would never go back to the life that I had before. If I could take back my cancer diagnosis, I wouldn't. Even if that means I only have 2 years of life left, I would not take it back still, because I have lived more in the last 2.5 years than I lived in the entire 29 that I lived prior to that. And cancer really sucks. And I would probably regret saying that. If I wasn't feeling well, I don't really know. But I do know that, like, where I'm at currently, it's just, it is life changing. But sometimes in like all the best ways.
I fully, fully, fully relate to that. I don't think I would go back and change my cancer diagnosis. I
Yeah.
think, like you, it was grappling with mortality that I think helped make the mental shift.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that my values changed. I think my values have remained the same pre and post diagnosis, but I'm just willing to live my values without worrying about the consequences of living my values.
Yeah.
And that has definitely shifted. And I find myself, I don't know, willing to take more risks in different ways. And I don't mean professional risks, I just mean emotional risks.
Yeah.
And I find it in a funny way, like the fear of death, or the lack of the fear of death, and the acceptance of that scenario in life has actually, in a funny way, like made the rest of life feel less scary.
Absolutely. I 100% relate. So when I first started having some of these feelings, I told my husband that like I felt like I wasn't allowed to talk about them, or I wasn't allowed to say these things because like I'm in a good place right now, right? So my opinion, I don't know what I'm going to feel like if I'm like knocking on death's door. But he reminded me like everybody's always going to have it worse than you, and you're not going to know until you're in that moment. So sharing the in between is really important. And I think that is honestly what I was looking for when I was so lost and like consumed by the fear of like what my final days were going to look like. Is I didn't know how to process that in between. And how I started it is literally exactly what you were just saying. I remember struggling between like so much anxiety and was like crippled by like I can't do anything until my next scan because then I'll know everything's okay. But then I'd get to my next scan and be like I can't do anything until I know the next time, and then I'll be okay.
Yeah.
And I just kept justifying that to myself until I eventually said, okay, well, I know I feel okay right now, and I've got 3 months until I will know what the next status of whatever it is. And so I started, for me, I started like doing things or taking chances or setting goals And in the beginning, when I was still very much grappling with the fact that like, I don't know how much time I'm going to have left, those thoughts came from I was scared to take the risk, but then I was like, well, what am I scared of? Like, if this doesn't work out and I die in 4 months, like I'm not going to be here for people to make fun of me. Like, I don't care. Like that sounds very abstracted isn't the word, but it's ridiculous. But I needed that to mentally like accept the risk of like, what's the worst that's going to happen? And then in my mind, I was like, well, if I'm not going to be here to see what the worst is to happen, why does it really matter? And it's really sad that it took that to push me to do that. But that's really what got me to start taking risks. And then once I started taking risks, I failed plenty of times. And then I learned, well, that wasn't so bad. So why don't I keep doing it?
I fully relate.
Like it sounds terrible, like especially saying it out loud, but that's what it was for me.
I definitely relate that. It was another friend who this was maybe like 6 months post diagnosis, and I was trying to explain this and like explaining this to someone who's like gone through it. It's like there's like I don't know, there's like shorthand, right? There's shorthand for like chemo sucks. Like got it.
Yeah.
Like, like there's shorthand at play, right? So when people don't have the shorthand, it's actually kind of hard to explain what it means to like really understand that 5 years is a luxury.
Yeah.
And to understand that having data to confirm 5 years is also a luxury. Like all of that is a luxury, right? And it's hard to explain. So this individual was talking to me and he looks at me and he goes, I would never describe you like this before, but you have a chip on your shoulder.
What?
That's bizarre. Like, I don't think I show up that way. And he's like, yeah, no, you don't. But there's something about like accepting your mortality and being willing to take risks that makes at least me, I think, show up. Like, I'm like, yeah, I'm willing to take risks. It's gonna, kind of like you, like, well, I won't be around for to see the outcome of this. So why the heck not? It's like it's a funny chip on the shoulder.
Yeah,
I could realize that's true, at least me. So
I could see that. Like, I don't know if I would describe it as a chip on your shoulder, but it's definitely like it's a really hard thing to put words to, but it's like I don't know, like what comes to mind for me almost is like nonchalant, but it's like not nonchalant. It's like acceptance. And what I think is really hard is one thing I've struggled with. I don't know if you've struggled with this at all, but like since I've come to an acceptance with some of those things, I recognize that other people have not, especially like friends and family. Even like I'll make jokes with like my doctors or like oncologists or something, and like they never laugh, but I'm laughing on the other side because I'm like, I've accepted this. Like we can laugh about this situation. And that is one thing that I still have a hard time like explaining or navigating around, because I don't necessarily know how to navigate around somebody else who hasn't had the acceptance. So like sometimes I'll say things of like, I mean, even a lot of what I do now. So like I create a lot of like web apps and tools and different things to kind of help other patients. And I want those things to exist in the world. But I build them in a way that they exist in the world for like, if I'm ever not there to finish this thing, I want somebody else to be able to pick it up. And I very intentionally like build things or create things that way, because I just have that acceptance in my mind that like I can't ever predict the outcome, but what I can do is make sure that this thing still comes to life after me. And when I explain that to other people, like I can feel the heaviness of that statement sit on them. Whereas to me, that is no longer a heavy statement. To me, that's a like, hey, I'm super excited for like, I mean, not super excited. That's terrible phrasing, but like, it's one of those like, I want you to be just as excited about this thing that I'm creating as well. And like the best thing that could ever happen if I passed is like that somebody wouldn't let this die along with me. Like, and it's just an acceptance of what the possibilities of that could happen. And I don't want to say that it's like, nobody ever knows how much time they have, because I think that phrasing dismisses so much. We can dive into that phrasing. I have very strong feelings about that phrasing. But at the same time, like, I do think if everybody lived that way a little bit more, that, I don't know, it changes your motives behind things, I think.
I cannot tell you how much I agree with you. I think, by the way, this podcast is going to be me agreeing with you and you agreeing with me, for what it's worth.
Yeah. We're in our own little echo chamber here.
We'll see how much of our audience agrees with us, or not. No, I definitely agree with that. I find myself kind of like you, like, kind of accepted the fact that I may not be around to finish these projects, and like you, I work in the space, and spending most of my time kind of building tools and resources for other people, and I really have accepted that. Okay, we may start this, and it may never actually get done, and a lot of my time and effort is what is the formal word? I think the formal word is like legacy planning or succession planning. But I think the word that my partner and I use is like got hit by a bus plan.
Yeah.
And it doesn't emotionally bother me at all. It's like, it's just the reality of the world. Like, it's just the reality of the life we have, right? Like, but
Yeah.
I do see how it really does not land well on other people.
And I think when other people hear that, like, they think like I've got a negative, like, I think something's going to happen to me. Yes. Whereas if you ask me, like, I've got a super positive outlook on life. Like, I want to think I'm going to be around forever. That's great. But I want, like, when I first got diagnosed, I felt like the rug got pulled out from under me, and kind of coming to acceptance of all the possibilities to me is setting myself up in a situation where that rug can never be pulled out from under me in the same way. Like, sure, I can be devastated by news, but it's not going to wreck everything in my life, because I've built my life in a way that it can continue on without me.
No, I fully understand. Yeah. I fully understand, and I was doing a lot of my time last year was spent kind of restructuring life to be what you just described, right? Which is like, let's say something happens and you do end up getting devastating news. Life shouldn't fall apart the way it did. And like, almost having the contingency plans in place. So
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I'm almost certain you've done this already, but like having advanced directives, like, it's just like the practical stuff, right? Like having your like will done, like, okay, not rich, don't have a lot, but this goes back to like, we're working on things that are important, and like the will is about making sure that has been taken care of.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you say that, and I knew that this was going to come up on this podcast, because like this is going to make me sound like I'm all talk here. So I've got an advanced directive at the NIH, and it was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I had not processed my whole, like, I mean, I had thought about death, and I like had gotten through some of it, but in that exact moment, I was so terrified of death that filling out an advanced directive in some ways felt like I was like, am I like manifesting this to happen to me? And I'm not, like, I wasn't a big manifesting kind of person at the time. But I had a really hard time filling that out. But I still haven't filled one out at MD Anderson, which is like the cancer center that I go to most often, which is terrible. And I do not recommend that for anybody. I need to do it. Every time I like get the paperwork that says like, do you have an advanced directive with us? I'm like, no. And then I make a mental note of like, okay, I need to go fill that out. And it's weird because I've accepted so much around this, but like for some reason, like I still don't take the effort to fill that one thing out, which I know I like need to do the most. And then like I haven't created a will. Like I've got little notes in my phone that I've jotted down at periodic times.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that I almost plan more of what is going on in my life currently than tapping into the past, because I don't know. I don't know if that's harder for me to like tap into than like the current moment and setting things forward from that.
I can understand that. I think it took me, I deferred the ADC and the will for 2 years. I think similarly, it was on my task list every year. Every year I got punted. And eventually I was just like, okay, I really have to do this.
I think part of it for me too is because like there's some decisions that I haven't made. Like do I want to be buried or cremated? And like those kind of decisions, like to me, they all feel like they're in the same category and of like, I have to make those decisions. And I don't know that I know what I want yet. And so part of me delaying some of those things is like, I don't know what I want for some of those. There's some things that I have learned, like I know I want a celebration of life instead of a funeral. And there's like little things that I've thought about for that, but like there's some decisions that are big that I haven't made. And like I defer making them because like, I don't know. It feels permanent to make those decisions, even though, and so until I feel like I'm 100% certain what I would want, I just have a hard time making those decisions in general.
I can totally understand that. For some reason, that the what happens to your physical body after death, that one for some reason never scared me. So in India, so I grew up in India, right? That in India you don't I mean Hindus don't, I shouldn't say in India. A lot of religions in India, but Hindus don't bury people. You kind of cremate. And there's a whole like 12-day process around it, which I actually think there's a lot of spiritual growth and benefit that's baked into the sort of not rituals, but the practices at play after death. And for whatever reason, and this is gonna sound so morbid, and part of me is like, do I say this? Do I not say this? I realize that this is an episode that will be out on the internet, so I'm like going back and forth whether I want to do it or not. So in my which document is it in? I can't remember which document is it in. There's some document, there's some legal word for like capturing your like death wishes or like funeral wishes. I don't think it's the ADC, and I don't think it's a will. It's something else, and I'm forgetting what it is right now. But I think I put down throw my body into the ocean, specifically the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean, because I've been scuba diving my entire life. And there's something really nice about knowing that my body can just be tossed and eaten up by sharks. And like become like true full circle. Anyway, this is like, you know, the loony ideas that I have in my head.
No, but that's it, right? Like it's so different for like everybody, and like what somebody like pictures is like peaceful or for full circle for them is like, I think very, very unique. And I think
You're so kind, Minnie.
What was that?
You are very kind.
No, I mean, getting eaten by sharks is terrifying to me. So, I mean, that sounds terrifying, even if like my mind is no longer there. But to somebody who loves the ocean, I can see how that would be like very, to me, that reminds me of like scattering your ashes near like a tree and letting the roots like kind of bring you back to life, or like that symbolism behind that. It's very similar, just in a throw my body in the ocean kind of way.
So on a like semi-serious note, do you oh man, this is like we're cracking up. Do you find it like are you able to have these conversations with your family? Very weird,
so it's interesting. So my dad my dad had a pretty severe health issue right before I got diagnosed, like 6 months before. He was in the ICU for several weeks, and he kind of, I think, had to face his own mortality through that as well. And so him and I can talk about some of these sometimes, and like we can make dark humor jokes, and like we get them. But I mean, I don't know, that it's kind of crazy because sometimes he'll say things and like they still hurt me personally, from a like, oh, that's my dad, like, and just the fear of losing someone. And so I can understand in those moments how like sometimes my own way of processing probably comes off to like my family or friends, of like there's that very personal connection, that even if somebody has processed their own mortality, like there's still pain associated with that sometimes. So I'll say with my dad, I can like joke and say some of those things sometimes, because he's, I think, kind of, I don't want to say grappled with some of the same things, but kind of had to face the same mortality and stuff. Whereas the rest of my family doesn't really. Like, I think it's much harder when I say those things. And I can sense that, like, I'll say the joke and it'll land flat, and then like I can feel, and then I feel bad, right? Because I'm like, oh man, like I can tell that this comment or this joke has hurt them. Um, but then my husband, for example, like we joke all the time. Like I can say most things and have the conversations with him, because that's like he's been along the ride with me for it and had to process a lot of it with me. There's still some things that are harder to talk about with him than it is to talk about with other patients, for example, like the thought of leaving him behind and stuff like that. But for the most part, like with him, I can kind of have all those same conversations. What about you?
I don't think so with my parents we lost well our grandparents, my grandparents, in the last few years. So I think their loss and like the family going through all of the kind of like end of life practices, rituals, medical things. I think that went on for quite a while for our grandparents. And that, I think, enabled the family to at least have a conversation about the practical side.
Mm-hmm.
So the practical stuff around like wills, ABCs, and things like that, I think it's uncomfortable, but we're able to engage in it.
Yeah.
The emotional side, not so much. Not so much. I don't think it's because I don't think they wouldn't be willing to hear me out. I think I kind of like you see the impact it has on them, and
Yeah.
I just don't want to do that to them.
Yeah.
It's almost like I don't know. I could have a
There's
kid.
yeah. I feel like there's a difference. Like to me, I think kind of exactly what you said. There's a difference when like you can talk with other patients or people who have kind of been in that place who understand that. But I'll say that I think that there's even a difference in some of that. Like some of the patients that I know that have passed, and like talking to them in their final days, and even when they had accepted it, and knew it was coming, like I felt the pain physically. And like their passing, of course, very much hurt me still. And I think about them all the time. And so I think there's some of those things that just can't be avoided, right? And I think that's where it's hard when like you've accepted your own mortality, right? Because like you can process that in a certain way. But at the same time, the processing that happens around that, like after you pass, I think is really important too. And I think that can be just as hard. Like, I honestly have a harder time thinking about how my death will impact those around me than I will impacting myself.
Yes.
But one thing I actually ended up saying to another patient as we were talking at ASCO this last week was talking about, we were kind of on this topic a little bit. And I remember saying that when I pass, like, I don't want people to be sad that I died. Like, I want them to remember that I lived. And I don't care if, like, I want them to take inspiration from my life. Like, I don't want them to feel like me passing is something that needs to bring their life down. Like, I want them to find some type of meaning or inspiration in it. Because I think of my friends that I've had pass now since I've had my diagnosis so long. I've lost quite a few friends, and I do take their memories with me for inspiration, and I build on some of the best memories that I have with them, and carry those things on. And like those are the important things that I think are important to talk about with people that you care about, or like at least have that concept out there, right? Like, I don't want you to be sad. And I think that's very important.
Yeah. I think what you just said, like, I think hit home for me something that I don't think I had grappled with, which is, I think I've intellectually grappled with it. I don't think I've emotionally grappled with it. Because I think there is like two sides of this, right? This is our family, our friends, like our partners. And then there is, I don't know if this is true for you, but this new family, right?
Yeah.
Because this diagnosis brings this whole community with it if you choose to participate in it. And that community, your odds are just stacked against you. No matter what you do, no matter how you cut the cake, they're just stacked against you, right? So
Yep.
you do end up having friends who are either have passed or are actively at death's door.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that this is true for you too, where even right now, as we sit and record this episode, we know a number of people, and like we know them intimately, who are very much like truly, truly at death's door.
Yeah.
In a way that maybe you and I are not.
Mm-hmm.
And watching them navigate it, I think, absolutely affects us, but it also allows us to iterate, for want of a better word, on our own acceptance of our own mortality.
Yeah.
So like there's this like bizarre, like we just don't get away from it, is I think part of what I'm trying to say. It's like we see it a lot more than maybe our families are seeing it, because they, to some extent, are shielded from that community. They belong to the community, but they have the option of not fully kind of diving into it.
I was thinking about this the other day because before I was diagnosed, I wasn't really exposed to death very much. Like I'd lost my grandmother and lost like my great grandparents, but I hadn't really lost very many people in my life. And so I hadn't really ever addressed death head on, and it like terrified me. And I was thinking about recently, like how much death that like I have encountered over the last 2 years, because I have lost people. And when you lose people in the community, it's not quite the same. Like it doesn't feel like somebody that you've never met in person or that you've only known for 6 months, because these are people who know the deepest, most intimate parts of your life. And so it is very hard when you lose them. But I will say that there was a couple things that were very monumental for me in kind of accepting my own mortality and the way that it changed the way that I live my life. And part of them was losing friends. And part of them was going through this process of, I told you I was just living like one scan to the next, just like very anxiously waiting. And it wasn't until I started losing a few friends and I noticed that they had gone from like being able to walk their dog down the street 1 week, and then like 2 weeks later, like they had passed. And it came out of nowhere for me. And so when I had seen that, and I'd seen it a couple times with several of different friends that I had through the community, and it made me realize how much you need to capitalize on the time that you have now. And it did change completely the way that I lived. Like before, I was using those scans as like, okay, I'll get the relief for like a day because I know in that moment I'm okay. And it changed it to like, I know as long as I feel well today, I'm going to capitalize that. And until I don't feel well, that is going to be when I start worrying about things. But I have from now until then to make the most of whatever time that I have. And I don't want to waste that. And I truly miss like all of my friends that I have lost. I'm not wearing it right now, but I normally wear a ring on my finger every single day for one of my very dear friends that had passed. And I actually, these earrings say "you can" on them. I made them in honor of her. And I carry those things with me, but very much to what you said of like, they do change and impact the way that you live your life. And I don't know if I wouldn't have ever gotten involved in the community the way that I did, I don't know if I ever would have learned to process my own mortality the same way, or even be living my life the way that I do now, because I did draw on the experiences of other patients, both living and who have passed, to help me form a lot of that.
I fully relate to that. And I think it's extremely true for me too. Very true for me. It really has been like, the more time I spend in the community, the more exposure to the community, and the more kind of deep bonds, the more kind of, I think my life continues to transform in a actually very good way. I feel very privileged about that. I did want to go to a slightly different place. It's only because it's somewhat close to my heart, which is, so we've spent a lot of time talking about bonds within the community, but how has accepting mortality for you changed bonds outside the communities, outside your immediate family and like partner?
I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question super well. Like it's changed the way I live my life, which has changed everything, right? Everything from the way that I interact with people to the way that they interact with me. like it's hard to kind of quantify that or even kind of explain that in a way, because it's just changed. It's changed me completely as a person. There's people that see me, especially when I share online, who knew me before my diagnosis, and they're like, "You are a completely different person," like, but in a good way. And they'll say like, "You're shining," or like they'll. I think the happiness that I feel now radiates out, and others can see that. And I think, honestly, I think that kind of helps them process and cope with everything that I've been through as well, because they can see that, okay, even though I'm going through something difficult and struggling, I think it's even been emotionally easier for them to see me in a better place and accepting of it, because it is really hard to watch people that you care about suffer. And so I think it's improved some of my relationships there, just because I think also the more that I talk, just quite frankly, about things, like when I say like, yeah, I mean, I hope for the best, but I never really know. Um, Almost the repetition of me saying those things kind of makes it okay, right? Like people kind of come to terms with like, okay. And it doesn't carry the same weight as it does probably the first time you hear it. And then you're like, ah, ouch, that hurts, I guess. Or to try to picture your life without somebody. What about you?
I think for me, it's been a little harder. I find it a little harder to connect, like truly, truly connect,
Mm.
outside the cancer community. And what I mean by that is not that I have very good friends outside the cancer community. It's not that. I think I'm an incredibly direct person. And I'm not as out on social media as I think you are with my personal story. Like I am out there with like content, but more in scientific, political, etc.
Yeah.
Versus like my story, and I just find it hard to. I think it's a me thing. I don't think it's a them thing. Like I find it hard to connect.
Yeah,
And
I
like,
totally see what you're saying on the like when you explain it that way. I can totally identify with what you're saying there, because this is actually something that I've grappled with more this year than I have any year prior, because I was staying very isolated when I was going through everything, because I couldn't ever afford having one of my scans or something bumped, because I got sick. And I, so I'll say I think my relationships with other people like has been improved because they can see how much happier I am, but the depth of those relationships has definitely changed. And I think it's twofold. Like I do think people open up to me a little bit more now than they did before, because I think when you're very open and vulnerable with what you've gone through, people will open up on that way too. And the people who've been vulnerable with me back, I feel like I am able to build deeper bonds with, because like there's like we're trauma bonding in many ways, right? But there are also other situations that I just very, very much struggle with just like just day-to-day social interactions, because hearing, especially like, so during COVID, um, being diagnosed in a bubble, my entire support community was online. And when you're in a community online of cancer patients, they're very supportive. Nobody is really tearing each other down. It doesn't matter what your beliefs are. You are just there for another person. And the community is so, so supportive. And so the first time I kind of came out of that, and at the beginning, first time I came out of that, most everybody was kind of just trying to hear my story and looking for updates. And so we weren't really falling back into regular life yet. But once I did, like, I noticed that I had a harder time listening to like people gossip, or like hearing kind of just the everyday, like little nuances to life that happen. And it's hard to say that. And I say that explaining it to you because I feel like you're going to understand it, but it's so hard to explain because I don't pass judgment on anybody in those situations. That is what life is. Like, I think that's just how people live their life. And I don't blame anyone for that. I just think that once you've gone through something like cancer or something that kind of shifts your perspective, like it's hard to sometimes sit in those situations because it feels, I don't even know what to say. Like it feels like it feels negative or draining for me anyways. And like it's really hard for me to sit in those situations, but at the same time I also am sitting in those situations thinking like, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to change anything, because absolutely nothing, like if I was in this situation before, absolutely nothing would change the way that I thought about it other than what I went through. And so I don't want other people to change, if that makes any sense
It makes
at
total
all.
sense. No, no, that's actually, you said it so well. I was at that. That was exactly the interaction I was talking about. It's not. It's like when you're vulnerable and people are vulnerable back, no matter what the life situation is, right? It's not that someone has to have gone through like cancer. It's just
Yeah.
the notion of vulnerability shows up, and because life can be really hard and not that hard, and you can still be vulnerable. You might be dealing with, I don't know, a personal situation. Either way, I think the vulnerability back really helps deepen the bonds. But it's the other interactions that I struggle with. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's the like almost mindless day-to-day chatter that happens in life
Yeah.
that I really struggle with. And it's not that I'm judging the other person for doing it. It's not that at all. In fact, part of me is like, I really wish I could do that.
Yes, a
Part
hundred
of me is like,
percent.
I want to be able to do that because I could do that in the past. I could sit on a like picnic and chat about nothing and
Mm-hmm.
spend time in that way. And I find myself not being able to do it.
Yes, a
And
hundred
then I
percent.
find myself like in those relationships, it does get shallower over time because I find myself almost like it's almost like I'm not skilled in that part of life anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And like I feel like a outsider looking in, being like, huh, like that's like the cool kids table operating in like with just different rules, right? They're just different social rules at play. And
Yeah.
I no longer understand the rules.
Yeah.
And
Oh
I
man.
no longer understand how to participate in this dynamic. And I'm like, huh, am I crazy? Like that, like I don't like. It's like, huh, I don't know how to like. I just don't know
Yeah.
how to play. It's like a game
I
I don't know how to play anymore. And I'm like, huh, okay.
I've never heard somebody like describe it or relate in the same way, because I've tried to explain the same thing to people, because it's like there's like a little like core piece of me that like I don't want to say is missing, because like I can't say I necessarily miss that. Like I do actually like the way that I process and think about things now, but there is a part of me that feels left out. And those are the things that like it's like you said, it's never judgment based. Like I don't judge people in those situations. If anything, like maybe there's a bit of jealousy of exactly
Yeah.
what you said, of like, man, I wish I could fit in. Like no matter how hard I try, like I'll see people or like even at conferences, for example, and stuff like that. Like I will see people interacting and talking about like just their daily lives and things happening in their daily lives. And especially my life now is so far removed from what normal is, quote unquote, or what like people like to do. Like for my birthday, I did a hackathon with my husband to build a tool for cancer patients, right? Like that's not normal. And that's not things that people can relate to, but they're things that I'm so deeply, deeply passionate about that like you sit me down to talk to anybody that's in the space, that I will talk to you for hours. But you sit me down at like a coffee chat where we're talking about kids, which I can't have because of cancer, or like
Mm-hmm.
what the latest trends are in pop culture. Like I can only talk to those to a certain extent. And then I feel kind of left out of those conversations. And it's not a like, I'm better than you situation. It's a like, I physically and emotionally don't know, I don't have those skills anymore. I don't know how to show up in those situations. And so I personally end up retreating from some of those situations. And I can feel it on the opposite end as well. I know I don't get invited to certain things anymore because I know like I'm the person that wants to go talk about sciencey stuff, right? Like
Yeah,
I'm not exactly the most fun person to have at a party.
I fully relate to that. It's exactly the dynamic you just described, which is I retreat, and as I retreat, naturally the other person's gonna like pull away. I mean, it's completely natural and understandable.
Yeah.
And then I feel exactly like that. It's like, huh. Like, I'm definitely the person in the party who like, it's like when people are like, so what did you know, COVID happened, what did you do? And you're like, do I really want to answer this question?
Uh-huh.
Do I lie? If you lie, because you know, you and I think are similar in that way, where someone Googles our name and the first thing that's gonna come up
Yeah.
is like, cancer diagnosis. You can't even like, you know, come up with like a pseudonym or a story or anything to cover it up. But yeah, it's exactly that. I'm like, okay. Next question, what do you do with your time? And I'm like, great.
You don't want to know.
It's like the basic normal questions that, you know, like are part and parcel of normal day-to-day interactions are just,
Yeah.
it's just really tricky.
I actually had this conversation, I had a full-on breakdown with my husband a couple weeks ago over this exact topic. Couple months, I don't remember. It's happened twice. But it was one of those situations where like I was kind of feeling judged for, because when people ask me what I do, or like they're so confused by why I advocate as much as I do, why I spend all my time doing what I do, why I'm not like taking some grand vacations or something like that. Like, honestly, half the reason why sometimes I take a vacation is because I feel pressured to take a vacation. Like, I get the looks from people that they don't understand the motives behind what I do. And I don't blame them, because like, I literally, like, I promised myself right before surgery that if I made it through it, like, I would dedicate the rest of my life to helping other patients or like making the experience better for other people, because I felt like I was given time that I like, it's like finding a 50 in your pocket, right? Like, I didn't expect to have this money. I didn't expect to have this time. So I'm going to make the most of it and like give it back is the best way that I can think of to do with that. And but it's just, I guess, such a foreign concept, I think, for some people, for it. Like, I truly enjoy doing this. Like, it's not work for me. It's something that I truly am passionate about. It's something I truly enjoy. I get tons of fulfillment out of it. And the whole breakdown thing happened when I was like, my husband has his office on the other end of the house, and I like was sitting down by the door of his office, and I was just crying because I was like, people don't understand, like, and I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like, am I not living my life the way that I'm supposed to? Like, am I supposed to want to go hang out with people constantly? Am I supposed to be building these really deep relationships because when I die, I'm supposed to have all these really deep relationships and people that care about me? And I broke down because my thing that I was saying is like, I don't just want somebody to have a memory of me. I don't. I want to leave a bigger impact. I want something that I do to actually make a difference. Not that I don't love and care about all the people that I love and care about, but like we were just talking about, like, I don't feel like my presence is adding anything to those conversations a lot of times. And I feel like I'm honestly ruining some of my relationships by showing up because I'm awkward and I don't fit into some of the conversations now.
Okay, I so relate to that. I can't tell you how many breakdown moments I've had about this exact topic.
Yeah.
It's eerie. Like, I literally have like goosebumps on my arm right now because it's exactly so many. But
Yeah.
like almost eerily exactly what you said. And for me, it was, I like distinctly remember this, it was actually exactly pre-surgery, because surgery had for me like very binary like odds. Like, if it went really well, like great odds. If it didn't go really well, like, well, hey, kind of, you know, not the best odds. And I remember spending a lot of time pre-surgery thinking about like, if the odds were good and if I got this new lease on life, like, what would I spend my time doing?
Mm-hmm.
And like, I have all of this like journaling done from it, and like, I remember committing to myself that I would dedicate my life
Yeah.
to making this situation much better for patients and families going through it. And I think, like you, it's like, there's almost no point in me repeating what you said because it's so identically similar. Well, the same word. The same. I am with you. It's so hard. And
Yeah.
I do find myself in a lot of situations where I feel like I am detracting from the social party at play. And therefore, it's almost better for me not to be there, because it's like, well, if I'm going to just bring the mood down, what's the point? And like, if I'm doing that and it's not actually helping someone, then I might as well stay home and spend my time doing other stuff. Like the classic example, like, and Arkan, my partner, and I go through this a pretty like regular cadence of me breaking down. It's like a Saturday night shows up, he's out partying, he's like, "You want to join?" And I'll be like, "Well, maybe I should join." I will like try and get ready, and then last minute I'll be like, "You know what? Actually, I don't think I can do it." And then I'll retreat, and then I'll spend the evening, because it's India morning. We have a nonprofit in India. I will spend the evening engaging with the Indian cancer community through WhatsApp. And my partner comes back home, great night out. How's your night, Samira? Great. I don't know, learned about some rare cancer disease happening in a rare population in India. It fulfills me. So in a lot of ways, it's really, really good. And in a lot of ways, I'm like, shit, I really should. I like want to be the person who can go out on a Saturday night in the city and enjoy myself. I really genuinely want that, because I could do that. Like I did that pre this diagnosis.
I think it's a
right.
balance, because I definitely, like, we are not the right people to give each other advice here, because I'm like, yeah, let's just stay home and not do anything, right? But I think it's a balance, because there's some things that, like, I very much am glad I showed up to, and I'm glad that I like participated, and especially like anything cancer related or like supporting other organizations, like I will show up for those things all day long. But because like there's that natural understanding there, right? And for those people, which is odd, like I can make small talk. I can make the same type of small talk, because there's just an understanding, I think, beneath it all. But and there's events that like I'm glad that I went to outside of that. But what's really shifted for me, and like what I had a hard time grasping and accepting, is like going kayaking or things that I used to do or enjoy by myself. Like mentally, I shifted at some point where I was like, there's a one-to-one relationship of me going kayaking. I'm the one that benefits. Nobody else gets anything out of that situation. Whereas if I spend my time doing something else, not only do I get the satisfaction out of that, because like it's naturally fulfilling to me, but it's a one-to-many situation where others can benefit from it too. And so like that's how I've kind of viewed like content creation, or kind of like you were saying, like you engage with the patient community, like the same thing. My husband is a big introvert, so he's never out partying. But he'll like play games or something like that instead, right? And like he'll be playing games, and while I'm like engaging with the cancer community, and I'll leave conversations where like I'm talking about like very real heavy things, right? Like mortality with other patients, or like I will have met a patient and connected them to like an institution that they need to go to. And like I've had patients that like that has changed their prognosis, just like other people changed mine through connections. And it's hard to explain the feeling of that, right? Because people are like, you give so much, like it's great, like that you're giving back and stuff like that. But that's not a one-way street. Like I feel good about it too, right? Like it's very fulfilling. And once you've had those experiences, it's really, really hard, in my experience, to replace those with just kind of some of the other experiences of life. And I definitely still, like, I'm big on like get out in nature. I love going for walks, and I'll do all of those things. But it's what percentage of my time do I spend doing that now? And what impact does that have on me? Like the impact I get from all of my other interactions is kind of what drives so much of what I do. And I think that's what makes, when I like get into those social situations when I'm trying to have those conversations again, like I'm not going to talk about the time that I went kayaking, because that to me doesn't feel very impactful. Whereas like that's honestly probably like more relatable in those moments, if that makes sense.
It does. It's almost like I was gonna. So usually at this point in the podcast, right, there's like an exchange of different opinions, and you share different points of view, and I'm like, well, nope, I agree with you. Sorry, Katie, fully agree with you. I have no differing opinion to anything you said.
I think what we're learning from this situation, though, is that like we're not alone, right? But I also do think that we have a very unique perspective too. Like I do recognize that my experience is not the experience of majority of cancer patients as well too. I think a lot of cancer patients do struggle like getting back into social situations and stuff like that. But I will acknowledge that the two of us are like very similar in the way that we think and the way that we do things, that like I think we are very, very heavily weighted there. But saying that, it is very refreshing to hear somebody else say that, so that the next time I'm having a breakdown in my husband's office, I'll be like, it's okay.
You can also just call me, be like, dude, breakdown moment.
Yeah. Get me through this.
Always there. You have my number. Yeah. Oh man, as usual, we're over time, by the way. This is
I figured.
This is a classic Katie Samira moment. But I am going to try and summarize, which I think I'm going to do a horrible job of today, so you may have to help me, because we've just spoken about quite a range of topics. So I think where we started with this was what mortality means to both of us, how we've grappled with the emotional aspects of thinking through it, how we've grappled with the physical aspects of it, how cancer has changed us or not changed us in different ways, how fear has shown up in our lives. We've spoken about how our interactions with the cancer community have made us better, have given us so much in life, has enabled both of us to be more fulfilled in a lot of ways, and I think be more authentic to who we are in a lot of ways. And then a lot of the struggles sometimes we face, and maybe slight incompetence on basic social skills, and maybe there's some learning and growth there for each of us in terms of, basic human interactions, and how, of course, our stories are not every patient's stories and every cancer caregiver stories, but there's a lot of comfort to know that at least there are two of us who've gone through somewhat similar experiences. So with that, Katie, thank you for being a guest on this podcast again. I suspect we will have you back on. And we'll certainly make an effort to have you back on, because I have truly, truly loved this episode. Almost as much as I loved the last one, probably more.
Yeah, I'm glad that you decided to approach this topic, and I've thoroughly enjoyed like talking about it and being able to have the conversations back and forth. I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is that I think to use the word journey there, but I think the journey for everybody is different but similar in the same way. There's very common themes, and then just figuring out kind of how you apply it to your own life. So I very much appreciate you having me on, and we've run over, I'm sure, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I think it's a topic that should be talked about.
Thank you, Katie. I really appreciate it. And we will be in touch. And I think most likely have you back to find some other topic that we will talk about, I'm sure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This podcast, show notes, and newsletter is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or any materials linked from this blog is at the user's own risk. The content here is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.